All right, I think we'll get underway. Just, reiterating about voting, we did a really wonderful series and ABNY talks on the Environmental Bond Act and the racial justice initiatives that are on the flip side of your ballot. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go ahead and check out our YouTube page. But we are here today to talk about the City of Yes. And in case you don't know me, I am Laura Colacurcio. I'm the Vice President here at ABNY, and I'm really delighted to be with all of our young professionals today. Before we turn the Zoom over to our friends at the Department of City Planning, we have a rock star ABNY Young Professionals Steering Committee member to kick us off. I'm grateful to introduce to you today Chelsea Goldinger, who is going to help us moderate this discussion. She's an ace in the advocacy, organizing, and public policy space and is currently working as the political programs manager for Amazon. Chelsea's experience includes stints for Cory Booker and the presidential campaign for Joe Biden. She's also worked at the powerhouse firm Kassir. She's been at the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center, and most recently as the operations director for the Test and Trace Corps at the NYC Health and Hospitals. Again, Chelsea's going to moderate this discussion for us today, and we've got a jam-packed hour for all of you. So enough for me. I will turn it over to Chelsea. Chelsea, thank you so much.
Thanks, Laura. And it's good to see so many familiar faces via Zoom. So excited to be here today and introduce our three panels. Mayor Adams most recently has introduced three proposals to help put forward a more inclusive and equitable city. And today we're going to hear from some experts about these amendments and specifically get in the weeds on how they will support small businesses, create affordable housing, and promote sustainability. We received a few questions ahead of time, so thank you so much for sharing those. We will go through a Q&A at the end and would love to sort of get more questions. So if you have them as you hear from each panelist, we ask that you share them directly through the Q&A feature. And then we'll leave about the last 15 minutes or so to go through those questions. So to start, I'm excited to introduce Nilus Klingel, who's the senior planner at the New York City Department of City Planning, who is going to talk to us a little bit about the Carbon Neutrality Amendment. Thanks, Nilus.
Hi, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And I am looking forward to talking about our project, City of Carbon Neutrality. Can we advance that slide? So I guess I would first touch on the fact that all of these projects are within this larger policy umbrella that the mayor's outlined called City of Yes. It's a focus on taking another fresh look at our regulations to make sure that they're doing everything they can to support job growth and our economic recovery in a number of different ways, whether that's use reform, housing reform, and even when it comes to sustainability, finding ways to provide flexibility and promote the growth of green jobs. So I just start with that because that's really the sort of built-in lens through which we're looking at sustainability and decarbonization as part of our project. Next slide. So yes, I'll be walking through carbon neutrality first, and then I'll pass it over to Matt for focus on economic opportunity and Sam for housing opportunity, and then we'll take questions at the end. So thank you very much. So first, just want to take a minute to frame our conversation. So why are we even talking about carbon in the first place? And it's important to emphasize that we are facing a climate emergency, and it's largely fueled by carbon dioxide emissions globally. Carbon dioxide makes up the vast majority of the United States' greenhouse gas emissions, 80% in 2019, and carbon dioxide generally comes from human activity. So that's going to be the combustion of fossil fuels like diesel, gasoline, natural gas, and home heating oil. In 2016, the world community joined together to sign the Paris Agreement, which was a vision to curtail human greenhouse gas emissions in order to, and this is important, limit overall global warming to 2 degrees Celsius and thereby prevent further environmental damage associated with climate change. And here in New York City, we've been implementing this vision through a number of initiatives under the umbrella of achieving carbon neutrality by reducing the city's emissions 80% by 2050, or 80 by 50 for short. Next slide. So I'm throwing this term carbon neutral around. What do I really mean by a carbon neutral city? Or at least how do we think about it at city planning? Recognizing there are a lot of different ways to look at this question. So So at city planning, we're really focused on reducing operational carbon emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. A carbon neutral city is a city where we've, one, reduced our overall energy needs vastly. And to do this, we'll have to retrofit almost every single building in the city to become highly efficient and reduce wasted energy. Second, it's a city where we've cleaned the grid. And to do this, we'll need to switch from fossil fuel powered electricity to electricity that comes from renewables like solar and wind. And thirdly, it's a city where we've electrified all of our remaining energy needs. And so that's going to include our vehicles and our buildings as well. This means moving away from fossil fuel fired furnaces and boilers in the basements of buildings to newer electrically powered technologies for heating and cooling, such as heat pumps located on the walls or atop buildings. And as you can see from this chart on the screen, the key driver of our city's carbon emissions by far is the building sector. And there's a big relationship between our buildings and the zoning laws that govern them. Next slide. So when it comes to our research on carbon neutrality, we are here at City Planning building on a very strong foundation. 10 years ago in 2012, the department issued Zone Green, the first comprehensive overhaul of our zoning to support emerging green technologies like rooftop wind and solar. We were dipping our toe in the water, but there's a lot of ways we could have gone further. So in some ways, you can think of the research we're working on now and that I'll be presenting to you today as a sort of follow-up to Zone Green, a chance to revisit these rules after 10 years and to update it in light of many of the technical and legal changes that have come since. Those include, on the screen, since 2016, a focus on decarbonization as opposed to just green building features or sustainability in a general way. And this focus coming from the Paris Agreement, of course, and 80 by 50. This also includes feedback we've gotten from practitioners, so architects, engineers, advocates about issues they've identified and ideas they have for improvements. And this is exemplified here on the screen with this report from the Urban Green Council called Zone Greener. And this also includes updating our zoning to reflect the Climate Mobilization Act at the city level, particularly Local Law 97, which will impose strict fines on large buildings which do not reduce their carbon emissions, as well as the CLCPA at the state level, which comes with a very ambitious set of solar and energy storage goals for the city. Next slide. Thanks. So this leads us to this project, Zoning for Carbon Neutrality. As a citywide text amendment, it will have the ability to positively affect every zoning district across the city, every community district, every borough. We're focused mainly on removing obstacles, I should emphasize from the get-go. There are so many challenges that home and building owners face in responding to our climate emergency, and we are busy analyzing our zoning regulations to ensure that zoning isn't one of the things holding people back from making climate-smart investments. And to a lesser extent, we're also taking a look at incentives, in particular existing incentives, to make sure that they continue to work into the future. For example, aligning existing incentives with the way that the new New York City Energy Code works and will work in successive updates into the future. And finally, we're taking a particularly close look at solar and energy storage in response to those city and state goals that I mentioned. They're very ambitious and have shorter time horizons than the 80 by 50 goals themselves. For instance, New York City has a goal to install 1,000 megawatts of solar by 2030. So some estimates have us around 300 megawatts installed currently. All of the solar panels you can see across the city today installed over the last several years. We're going to need to see a threefold increase minimum over the next 8 years to meet that goal. So it's a real rapid rollout of that technology. Next slide. So zoning, our carbon neutrality research will focus on fixing impediments in 4 key areas. So as I mentioned, energy, and it will do that by supporting the greening of our grid by broadly allowing for distributed generation. So that's wind and solar, as well as critically needed energy storage. I'll touch on that in a little more detail in a second. On the building front, we're looking to get zoning out of the way of making buildings clean and efficient by changing the zoning rules to accommodate a wider range of building retrofits. When it comes to the transportation sector, supporting the growth of electric vehicles and micromobility by removing restrictions on where this type of infrastructure can be placed. And then when it comes to our city's solid waste and stormwater streams, complementing other city efforts to reduce our solid waste and stormwater by updating and clarifying how our zoning regulations pertain to those efforts. To give you a sense of the issues we're looking at, which can get pretty into the weeds pretty quickly, I'm going to be showing you 5 key examples of the types of problems we're looking into. First example, next slide. The first pertains to rooftop solar. So 10 years ago, in 2012, Zone Green created new rules to allow rooftop solar to be installed above rooftops, even if that's above your zoning height limit. However, we were also greatly concerned with preserving neighborhood character and instituted height limits on the panels themselves, setbacks from the facade, and rooftop solar caps in terms of coverage. This intent was to keep the solar installation small and inobtrusive and hard to see from the street. However, since 2012, the climate emergency has really grown in urgency, and we realize how much more solar we need to get installed on our rooftops and the need to do so as quickly and as expeditiously as possible. So if you overlay our zoning rules, as well as other rules adopted since 2012, and that includes rules from FDNY about rooftop firefighting operations, the result is, illustrated here, only a small portion of the rooftop can actually be used for elevated solar canopies. So if you're looking at this diagram here, on a typical mid-density building rooftop, the red tinted portions of this solar canopy would not be permitted under our zoning, only the portion outlined in green. And at scale, across thousands of buildings, the zoning limitation is going to dramatically reduce the amount of square footage available for solar and therefore our energy generation capacity. Hold us back, and this will hold us back from meeting our solar goals. Next slide. Next example pertains to energy storage, essentially big batteries, literally lithium-ion batteries like you have in your cell phone or your laptop or your electric car. And energy storage is going to be a key component of a clean energy grid, saving energy generated by the sun and the wind for times of peak demand, such as a summer evening when millions of New Yorkers return home after a busy day and crank up their air conditioning. We won't be able to just fire up another fossil-powered turbine like we used to. Energy storage systems, or ESS for short, will be needed at grid-owned sites, but they'll also be needed near the points of consumption, thus embedded in our city's neighborhoods, where energy can be pre-positioned to help avoid brownouts or the use of dirty peaker plants. Classic story when it comes to zoning, though, is that energy storage, since it's a new technology, is not addressed in our old zoning rules. There's a special permit that you can obtain from the boards of standards and appeals, but the process takes several years. It's been used by very few people and simply promises to stymie the rollout of this urgently needed emerging technology. And we have been and will continue to work with our partners at DOB and FDNY to explore safe and appropriate as-of-right allowances to allow for the broad adoption of energy storage across the city. Next example. The next example relates to building retrofits. Basically, every one of our city's million buildings will need to be retrofitted for efficiency and electrification. And zoning can be a barrier to this in a number of small technical ways. So one example shown here relates to a reclad of a whole building. If a typical mid-century office building were to remove its entire thin, leaky curtain wall, say about 4 inches thick, typical, and replace it with a thicker, high-performance curtain wall, say like 11 inches, they'll run into a zoning problem. And that is that zoning considers your wall thickness as a general rule built into our zoning rules to be part of the FAR, or the development rights of the property. So your wall and the thickness of your wall counts as part of the square footage of your building. So if your building was built to its maximum FAR, and this is generally the case, and you want to take down your curtain wall and replace it with a thicker one, that would increase the size of your building. It would increase your FAR, and this is not allowed. So this zoning prohibition would stop that retrofit dead in its tracks. And this is an example among many small technical glitches that we're cataloging and planning to resolve as part of this work. Next slide. Turning to the transportation sector, we know that New York City is lagging when it comes to electric vehicle adoption. A fraction of 1% of the nearly 2 million private vehicles registered in New York City are zero emission. There are a lot of hurdles to EV adoption. So that's cost, supply chain, federal policy, all of which is changing too. Zoning may not be the biggest issue, but we believe it is a contributing factor. And that is because in dense urban environments, one of the biggest challenges to owning an EV and convincing someone to adopt an EV is finding an off-street parking space to charge the car overnight. On-street charging is regulated by DOT, and our zoning rules here at City Planning regulate off-street parking, and specifically EV charging in one of two ways. First, imagine a freestanding electric gas station where members of the public can pull up and quickly charge. These facilities are not allowed in the widest range of zoning districts in the city, and that's something that we're looking into to expand. The second is that zoning does allow charging to be added to any existing parking space and any existing parking facility as an accessory use. However, this does not override the rules around how that parking space, whatever type of parking space it is, how that parking space can be used. So if the space was required by zoning, for instance, due to the construction of a residential building, that EV charging infrastructure attached to that accessory parking space can only be used under our zoning rules currently by residents of that building. And this is another example of something that we're looking at loosening up, so that if a building owner invests in EV infrastructure and it's underutilized because residents don't have EVs or they're just away for the weekend, we want zoning to allow, at least for other EV owners in the neighborhood, to be allowed to benefit from that underutilized infrastructure by charging up when it's unused. And finally, the fifth example is turning our storm waste, our solid waste and stormwater, turning to the solid waste and stormwater, for an example of how a small change could make improvements to our stormwater collection. So while our waste stream is a relatively small part of the city's carbon footprint, as we saw in that slide at the beginning, compared to the building sector, for example, it does have some pretty straightforward solutions. For example, when stormwater flows into our combined sewer system, it's directed to the city's stormwater treatment plants, where it must be cleaned before being returned to the environment. And this is a very carbon intensive process. This water instead could be retained on site. And one way to do that is through the use of bioswales or rain gardens, which absorb extra stormwater during storm events and then slowly release it over time. Now, zoning requires street trees to be installed along the sidewalk whenever a new development or enlargement occurs. That's an underlying rule that applies in our zoning today. But those street trees are just standard street trees, and the detail of their installation in the curb is just a standard tree pit. But there's an opportunity here to update those rules and allow for other innovative designs, such as rain gardens designed by DOT and DEP and depicted here in this photo to be used as well. And with that, those are the 5 examples of things that we're looking into to support a city of carbon neutrality. I'm looking forward to your questions at the end, and I'll turn it over to Matt to talk about economic opportunity research.
Thank you, Nilus, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Waskiewicz, and I'm a planner at the Economic Development and Regional Planning Unit here at City Planning. And I'm the lead planner on an initiative called City of Economic Opportunity, which is a zoning initiative that is citywide in nature, and it will make it easier to grow or locate a business across the city and take aim at storefront vacancy by modernizing and clarifying our city's zoning resolution, allowing a wider range of activities that can create vibrancy along commercial streets and lowering the cost and time it takes to start a business here in the city. And so we have 3 main goals for this work. The first is to create a more resilient economy and allowing existing spaces to be repurposed. In many cases, our zoning, as I'll detail in a few minutes, might be getting in the way of businesses' ability to understand where it is they can locate and what they can do in their space and be able to adapt their spaces as time goes on. Our second goal is to allow the creation of flexible kinds of new space that can meet the needs of businesses and help grow jobs and make sure that the buildings that we're building that are coming online in the coming years are flexible enough to meet the needs of a changing economy. Our third goal is to bring jobs closer to where people live, especially in transit accessible locations across all 5 boroughs. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to walk through some illustrative examples of the kinds of challenges that we've heard here at City Planning that we believe that this initiative can help address. And we see some opportunities to make sure that our zoning is fostering a business environment that can lead to economic growth and vibrancy coming out of the pandemic. And so our first example is one of a bike shop owner, and they're on the Upper West Side, and they've been doing some bike sales, but they're interested in expanding what they do to include some bike rentals and repairs. And this is a pretty typical range of services for a business like this. However, they're in one of our neighborhood commercial zoning districts, a C1 district. And right now in our zoning, there are kinds of restrictions that are put in place. They're allowed to do bike sales, but they can't do bike rentals or repairs. And so they would either have to relocate to a different zoning district, or they would have to remain where they are without growing the business in the way that they would like to do. And so this is just one example of many in which our zoning is outdated and frankly unnecessary or has confusing restrictions that can make it expensive or time consuming for a small business owner to understand where they can locate and what they can do in their space. And this is especially true in our neighborhood commercial districts, our C1 districts. And so City of Economic Opportunity will modernize and clarify this zoning to reduce the time and cost it takes to start a business and give entrepreneurs clarity about where they can rent space. And we believe that this can save them tens of thousands of dollars. In our second example, we have an artist in Harlem. They're interested in opening up a studio to teach arts to children. They found a perfect space for a lease, lots of high foot traffic in this vacant storefront. But they're in a C4 district, one of our higher density commercial districts. And right now in our zoning in a C4 district, art studios and a number of other commercial uses are not permitted, especially on the ground floor. And so this artist will have to keep looking to find another zoning district that would allow them to open up a studio. New York City has more than 8,500 vacant storefronts. And this initiative will take aim at storefront vacancy by allowing a wider variety of activities to occur in our commercial zones. This will open up more spaces for new kinds of businesses to locate and reducing storefront vacancy across the city, creating thousands of jobs in the process. One of the ways we hope to do this is by fixing the outdated prohibitions on certain activities on the ground floor, like art and dance studios. City of Economic Opportunity will allow these businesses to locate on any commercial street. In our third example, we have a building owner in Sunnyside, Queens, who's had some difficulty leasing space over the last few years. But recently, a high-tech manufacturer reached out to them, and they're interested in leasing a floor of this industrial loft-style building. However, zoning requires that the number of loading docks that you have are based on the current use of the building. So if you are changing from an office-based use to a manufacturing-based use, as in this example, you would have to physically retrofit your building, add additional loading docks, and this may be too cost prohibitive or just not possible in a building like this. And so it could result in this high-tech manufacturer not being able to go into this vacant space or not being able to locate in the city at all. And so as part of this initiative, we want to level the playing field and make sure that if you're trying to get into an existing building, that you don't have to retrofit and add a bunch of what could be unnecessary loading requirements. In this example, we have an owner of a tapas bar, and they have live music on weekends, but they're interested in setting aside a small space for dancing. Despite the city repealing the cabaret laws a few years back, the zoning still prohibits dancing in many commercial districts, including in the neighborhood C1 district where this business is located. And so they would not be allowed to have any dancing. And so the cabaret laws have a history that's rooted in discrimination, and the city council had voted to remove these restrictions in the city's administrative code, but zoning still prohibits dancing of any kind. And so this initiative in many different commercial streets. And so this initiative will address the discrepancy by bringing our zoning into alignment with the city council's intentions when they repealed the cabaret laws. In this example, we have a bakery in Brooklyn that's been very successful, so much so that they've been interested in expanding what they do and to an adjacent vacant storefront. This will allow them to not only continue to sell on a retail street, but will also allow them to sell to other local businesses and restaurants in the area. But right now in our zoning, bakeries can't have more than 750 square feet of production space, or else they would be considered a food manufacturer and they would have to relocate to one of our M districts, one of our industrial areas. So unfortunately, right now in our zoning, there's just not a path forward to growing a business like a bakery in this location. So as part of City for Economic Opportunity, we're looking to raise the cap on the amount of space that a bakery can have for production, but also for the first time allow a whole host of small scale producers, like other kinds of food manufacturers, but also apparel makers, woodworking shops, jewelry makers, and other kinds of what our zoning considers custom manufacturing to locate in a small scale in any of our commercial districts. when you look to other cities across the country, many of them allow these kind of maker spaces to exist. And so we think that it just makes sense to modernize our zoning and allow entrepreneurs who are making things to be able to produce them on a commercial street. And as part of this, we're also looking to introduce the ability for our entrepreneurs and our makers to be able to produce and sell in a retail setting in the same location. So these are things like brew pubs and coffee roasters, ceramic studios, and the like, which are currently not allowed to exist in a commercial street, only in one of our industrial zones. In fact, this initiative represents the largest expansion, we think, of space available for local manufacturing in more than 60 years. In this next example, we have an owner of an industrial building also in Sunnyside, Queens. They have a film lighting rental business, and they've been very successful. They're the building on the left here of this photo. And as they've grown, they've been considering a way to expand upward and add a couple of additional floors for production space and some offices, and then keep the ground floor for storage of their equipment. And ideally, they would match the size of the industrial loft building on the right-hand side of this photo. However, when the owner reached out to city planning to explore a zoning change, they discovered that our zoning today, in fact, does not have any tools that would allow for a 3-story industrial building. And so this person, to expand their business, may have to relocate outside of the city entirely in order to find the kind of space that they want. And so as part of this initiative, we're looking to create some new zoning districts, some new tools that allow for businesses like Terrence and other kinds of industrial businesses to grow upwards and remain in the city as part of their work. One last example for you, and this is of a community member who's concerned about the impact that a dark store or 15-minute grocery delivery might be having on the neighborhood. They think the fact that the windows and doors are papered over, it might be harming the pedestrian experience on the commercial street. And so our zoning does have some ground floor design requirements in some locations, but they change from neighborhood to neighborhood, and they don't apply in this particular area. In fact, in many kinds of our what we consider to be our urban design or streetscape regulations, there are more than a dozen different sets of regulations across the city, and they are located in all different parts of thousands of pages of our zoning resolution. And so it's very difficult for businesses to understand what the rules are in their location. And so we're hoping to create some more clear and consistent streetscape rules that can be easier for businesses to understand, but can also activate and create vibrancy along our sidewalks and our commercial streets. So bringing this all together, at City for Economic Opportunity will do many things, we hope, that can add up to creating a more economic vibrancy along our commercial streets, accelerate the city's recovery coming out of the pandemic, and ultimately create a more resilient and equitable city for all New Yorkers. And we're going to do this in several ways. The first is to create a range of new, making sure that we have similar activities in similar districts, and in many cases, clear out some of the now 60-year-old regulations that we think don't make sense, they're confusing, or they're inconsistent. And so these are the regulations that govern the kinds of uses or activities that are allowed on our commercial streets. So this is first the example of the bike shop owner that I gave earlier, where you have one set of regulations for C1 districts, which are a neighborhood commercial district, another set of regulations for our C2 districts, which in fact may be located in the same location as our C1 districts. They're both neighborhood commercial streets, and there's very little distinction between them. And so we think that they should allow for the same range of activities, same mix of businesses. It just makes sense for small business owners who are operating on our neighborhood streets. Similarly, in our office and regionally serving districts, these being our C4, C5, and C6 districts, we think they should permit a similar range of activities that we can make sure businesses have flexibility to find space that works for them and ensures that neighborhoods can be fully occupied and activated. As part of this work, we're wanting to remove restrictions that currently exist in our C4 and C5 districts that don't allow a number of activities to be on the ground floor. This is the example of the art studio that I gave earlier. As part of City for Economic Opportunity, we're wanting to be more permissive about activities that are currently constrained by our zoning. So this includes small-scale clean production, like 3D printing, jewelry making, and other kinds of custom manufacturing to be allowed to locate outside of our industrial areas, as well as allowing maker retail businesses like brew pubs and coffee roasters and others like them to be allowed for the first time outside of our industrial areas. As part of this, we're wanting to also remove the outdated restrictions on social dancing within our bars and venues. As part of this initiative, we're wanting to address the fact that when buildings convert from one use over time to a different use over time, it may trigger the need for physical retrofits and additional loading docks that we think just don't make sense in today's economy. And so we're wanting to make sure that businesses can remain occupied as the economy changes over time, and that this will help what we've heard has been some challenges to filling buildings that have some of these requirements. As part of this initiative, we're also wanting to create a range of new zoning districts that could be mapped in the future to support job growth. And so this would be mid-density industrial districts that mimic the historic look and feel of our loft style buildings. A fun fact is that in 1961, the last time we really looked at our zoning, we effectively outlawed all of the industrial loft style buildings that you see throughout the city. Our zoning at the time thought these kinds of buildings were obsolete and that the manufacturing of the future would be based more out in the suburbs in car accessible locations. Well, we found that to not be the case. And so we're trying to correct the record and give businesses, industrial businesses, the space that they need to expand. And then finally, as we're being more permissive about use within space, we're also wanting to make sure that our storefronts are designed to be attractive and activate our sidewalks. And so we're proposing more clear and consistent design requirements across our commercial districts. So with that, I also welcome any questions you have, and I'll turn things finally over to Sam to talk about City of Housing Opportunity.
Good afternoon. Hi, all. I'm Sam Levy. I work at the Department of City Planning's Housing Division, and I'm excited to be here today speaking to you about the City of Housing Opportunity. Next slide, please. The proposal ideas that we'll share today emerge directly from where we live. The city's Fair Housing Report, written by HPD with over 150 community organizations and dozens of meetings all over the city. The experiences shared throughout where we live highlight the human costs of our housing shortage, not only high rents, but displacement pressure, segregation, gentrification, tenant harassment, and homelessness. In many ways, all the worst things about housing in New York City are a direct result of there not being enough housing for the people that want to live here. Where we live also offers an honest appraisal of how we got to where we are today, which is a very diverse but extremely segregated city that doesn't offer New Yorkers adequate housing opportunities. The report outlines goals and strategies that we as a city can take to further fair housing principles. As a part of this work, the proposals we'll share tonight aim to remove many of the obstacles to equitable housing development. We believe that relatively small changes to the zoning across a wide geography can create a lot of housing. And when every neighborhood does its part, no single neighborhood will be unfairly targeted or face dramatic changes. Next slide, please. We're talking to you very early in the process, before we've started to draft any zoning text for the proposals themselves. We're sharing our current ideas as they stand to answer your questions and gather your feedback as well as feedback of, everybody, the communities around New York City. With that said, here are some of the things that we're looking at this point. First, we want to allow housing types that serve everyone. We're thinking about types that have historically filled an important gap in the housing market, but that we've made it difficult or impossible to achieve, often as part of land use regulations' legacy of racial and economic exclusion. These housing types include accessory dwelling units, studio apartments, and shared housing models, each of which could help to meet people's urgent housing needs today. Next, we also want to ease conversions of underutilized non-residential buildings into housing. This accomplishes two important planning goals, both creating more housing and giving new life to obsolete buildings. We also want to prioritize people over parking. This means reducing or eliminating parking requirements where our research demonstrates that they are unnecessarily preventing the construction of new housing. We also want to give all forms of affordable housing, including supportive housing, the same preference that we already give to affordable senior residences in medium and high density districts. By expanding this preference to forms of affordable housing beyond senior housing, we can promote the equitable production and development of these units across the city. And finally, we want to make it easier for owners of homes and small buildings to get what they need from the city, whether that's us at the Department of City Planning or one of our sister agencies like DOB, HPD, or BSA. You shouldn't have to have an expediter on staff or even know what an expediter is in order to adapt your home to meet your family's needs. Next slide. Now I'm going to take you through 6 examples that illustrate these proposal ideas. First, we want to eliminate barriers that prevent you from building what a zoning district already claims to allow. Here, we have a single family home in a 2-family district. Let's say you wanted to add a small second unit to your home for your elderly mother, something that you might think would be straightforward, given that your property's zoning district allows 2-family homes. Well, the hyper-specific regulations that we've layered on over the years would basically make that impossible. First, there'd be a requirement for a second off-street parking space, even though your mother, like many residents of small units in multifamily buildings, doesn't drive. In addition, the large minimum unit size, larger than your mother even wants, would be impossible to accommodate in your building. Zoning also blocks you from adding an exterior staircase as an entry to a second floor unit here, meaning you'd have to undertake major interior renovations that would be cost prohibitive and impractical. So in reality, you would not be able to do a 2-family house in what is supposedly a 2-family district. And we'd like to change that. Through adjustments to the zoning, we can make it simple to build a 2-family home in a 2-family district. By addressing some of the restrictions that we've layered on incrementally over the decades, we can make our districts actually do what they claim to. Next slide. Staying in the low density parts of the city with our next example, we would like to re-allow successful building types that already exist in these areas. Here you have a building form that probably looks familiar to anyone who has spent time in Queens or other low density parts of the city. There's 2 or 3 stories of residential above a ground floor of local retail. If the owner of the 1-story buildings on the left wanted to replicate that today, they'd quickly find out that it's just impossible. First, the combined parking requirements for both the commercial and residential are so high that the site doesn't have room to provide them. These parking spaces prevent the construction of a mixed-use building, regardless of whether or not it's a realistic expectation that residents or retail customers would actually be using a car. Secondly, even though every building up and down the block is built like what you see on the right, height limits and floor area limits imposed after these successful buildings were realized make it impossible to replicate the mixed-use form. We'd like to look at adjustments to lower density commercial districts to make this type of housing possible again as well. Next slide. We also want to enable other forms of housing across the city that many New Yorkers know and love. Here we have a building full of simple, no-frills studios. Although New York has many such buildings, you wouldn't be able to build one today because we implemented minimum average unit sizes in the 1961 zoning resolution. We know that a lot of people in New York City want to live alone, but can't. By not providing this variety of housing options, we currently force people into roommate situations or other unstable living arrangements. We want to change that and instead encourage housing types that serve everyone, which will also help to relieve pressure on family-size units elsewhere in the city. For example, in today's housing market, younger New Yorkers are forced to find roommates and take multi-bedroom apartments in neighborhoods around the city. Elderly people are trapped in large homes that are a burden for them to maintain, and marginally housed populations are left in unsafe or exploitative living situations. We can adjust the rules to make a variety of housing types possible again, allowing people to make their own choices about where they want to live. Next slide, please. The next of our goals is to ease conversions of obsolete and underutilized buildings to housing. Let's say we have a vacant hotel that was acquired by a housing nonprofit, and the nonprofit wants to convert it to supportive housing. The nonprofit staff working on this, however, will soon realize that our current zoning regulations would make that difficult to impossible. While we do have relaxed regulations intended to facilitate the adaptive reuse of non-residential buildings, they wouldn't be applicable since supportive housing is considered a community facility use, not a residential one. That means that the nonprofit would be stuck with an overbuilt building that doesn't comply with light and air standards, and they aren't able to convert it to supportive housing. If the nonprofit then tried to convert the building to residential, they'd run into an obstacle caused by the dwelling unit factor, which determines the minimum average unit size, similar to what I described on the previous slide. The required minimum average unit size is far greater than the current size of these hotel rooms, so the nonprofit would need to combine hotel rooms, doing some serious renovations, and in the end, they'd likely need to convert those units as high-end housing to justify the construction costs, which is a very different outcome from the original goal of creating supportive housing. Other issues that complicate conversions are that current regulations only apply in certain parts of New York City, such as Manhattan below 60th Street, parts of Brooklyn and Queens that are along the East River. So there's a geographic limitation. There's also limitations in terms of the age of buildings that can use them in most places. The building will need to have been built before 1961. So we're looking into different ways to address these challenges and make our conversion regulations more broadly applicable so we can turn more of these obsolete and underused non-residential buildings into the affordable and supportive housing that New Yorkers need. Next slide. Another one of our goals is to give all supportive and affordable housing the same preference already given to affordable senior housing. For this example, we're looking at Bushwick. Let's say there's a church that's interested in rebuilding and even including housing on top of the church building. Because of zoning regulations, the church will be limited to about 35 units, but they want to build more units because they recognize their community needs housing. One way they could do that is by adding affordable senior housing, which gets a higher FAR than other types of housing. And for the uninitiated, FAR refers to floor area ratio, or the ratio between lot square footage and building square footage. The higher the permitted FAR, the larger a building is allowed to be, and the more people that can be housed there. However, the higher FAR would only apply if the affordable units were set aside for seniors. Well, what about other families or New Yorkers who aren't seniors who still need affordable housing? Currently, non-age restricted affordable units get a lower FAR. We're thinking of giving the same FAR to all forms of affordable and supportive housing across the board as we do already for senior affordable. By doing so, we can increase the availability of affordable housing across the city. And an additional 10 or 12 units in this one corner in Bushwick may not seem like much, but if hundreds of similar sites were also able to build an additional dozen affordable units, the number of affordable housing available would be much greater. Next slide, please. And lastly, we're interested in reducing or eliminating unnecessary parking requirements to allow for more housing development. So moving next door from Bushwick to Bed-Stuy, there is a developer interested in building out this lot and adding a residential building. This lot could fit up to 20 units, but rather than build that many units, the developer would stop at just 10. So they can waive out of the parking requirement, because as soon as they add the 11th unit, they would have to fulfill a 6-spot parking requirement, which would be really difficult to fit on this site. If we make adjustments to the waiver threshold or to the requirement ratio, or if we decide that this is an area where parking should be optional entirely, then we could see up to an additional 10 apartments on this lot. Again, 10 apartments might not seem like a lot, but when hundreds of sites across New York are able to build more housing, that would result in a lot more housing available to New Yorkers. Overall, we want to prioritize people over parking, and by doing so, we can reduce development costs, make streets safer, and enable the creation of more housing that helps neighborhoods thrive. Next slide. So that's it for zoning for housing opportunity. City of housing opportunity. And I think we're all looking forward to hearing some questions from you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam, and thank you to the three of you. That was such a great presentation, especially the examples were so illustrative. Nilus, if you want to come on camera as well, Figured we'll start with the folks who have submitted some live questions and then transition to those if we have time. We got ahead of time. So starting sort of with, I think, the natural transition, which is, it was so interesting. I think there's a lot of meaningful change here. What's next, and what can we do for folks on the call who want to be supportive to help move these changes forward?
Sure. Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you, Ariane, for who put that question in the chat. I think one of the first things you can do right now is to give us feedback. We're at the very early stages of this process. None of these, what we call city text amendments, they have to go through our land use review process next year and the following year. We're still in the various draft stages of thinking through what these changes might be. So we want to hear from you. And so if these are the right examples, if these ring true in your own lives, in your experiences, we want to hear that. But if we're missing the mark, we also want to hear that. So we encourage you to reach out to us at nyc.gov/cityofyes. We have some ways where you can learn more information and send us emails. But what I would also ask is that if you are part of an organization that would like to hear a similar presentation to this, we want to know that as well. We're really trying to get the word out as much as we can. And then as we get closer to our public review process next year on some of these initiatives, we would welcome your participation as well. We're going to need a coalition of support around all three of these initiatives to make sure that they are passed through our public review process. And so we're looking for active participation at all stages.
Thank you for that. We have another question for you, Matthew, from Banu asking, saying, are there any existing maps that show the neighborhoods with the most restrictive zoning rules that have prohibited some of this economic growth we've been talking about in certain areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that we've been thinking about, our ways to visualize the status quo or the way that things are working or not working for folks, and then what this change might be. And so in terms of mapping, what we can show right now is our existing districts and where they're located throughout the city, and use that to then look at what our zoning says about what's allowed and what's not allowed in these districts and where these changes might occur so that we can make some changes that make sense. So for example, we have our C1 and our C2 districts. They're both considered neighborhood commercial districts. And in many parts of the city, you have a C1 district on one side of the street and a C2 district that's either right next to the C1 district on the same avenue, or in fact, in some locations, it's right across the street. So your left side of the street is a C1, your right side of the street is a C2. And so on the left side of the street, you're not allowed to have things like a movie theater or bike repair. But on the right side of the street, you can have a movie theater and bike repair, no problem. And so if you're a business owner wanting to locate, you might not know that because our zoning is very complicated and confusing. And so you might have to hire someone to figure that out. Or you go into the business thinking, or go into your street thinking, yeah, no problem, I can locate here. And then you get slapped with a fine because you in fact cannot locate where you thought you could. So there's all sorts of ways in which we think this might be prohibiting economic growth. It's very hard to quantify. And so I think what we're doing now is talking about all the examples of these head scratchers of why does our zoning prohibit movie theaters on one side of the street, but not the other side of the street. We're trying to get those out of the way as much as we can. So I'll send a link into the chat when I can dig it up for our land use maps, which you can explore online and see for yourself in your own neighborhood where this might be occurring.
I'll also give a plug. I do. It has some amazing maps that kind of show a lot of these things, and you can click different features and overlay them. That I think it is honestly really fascinating and often surprising. Kind of going a little more in the weeds, we have a question from Charlotte as a follow-up on the electric vehicles pieces, asking, thinking this through, what are the trade-offs of requiring some percentage of parking spaces to be equipped with charges, which would, she's saying it would be a stronger action than merely enabling properties to offer non-resident charging. So I think thinking through those trade-offs and the pros and cons there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, first, I'll say I am all for charging, requiring EV chargers. The state of the the legislative landscape there is interesting. So zoning does not have such requirements, and it's viewed in New York City as the domain of the building code. The building code specifying all sorts of things about, how a parking facility needs to be designed, arranged, the equipment that it has to have, and EV charging being seen as one of those things. So currently in New York City, we do not require EV chargers anywhere. The building code was amended a little while ago, a few years ago, to require EV capability for a certain percentage of spaces. I have some slides I could throw up really quick since we're doing this on the fly, if that's all right, Matt.
Yes. Do you want me to pull down my screen so you can share yours?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks. So just on terminology. So something we're looking at city planning is, how can we help get more EV charging through increased flexibility and incentives as opposed to requirements? And just to understand where the requirements are, New York City code requires EV capability for a percentage of spaces in new garages and new parking areas. But that really doesn't go very far in terms of actually promoting EV charging. There's this 2 tiers beyond that. One is EV ready, in which, so I should start at the beginning, EV capability, talking about having sufficient electrical supply at the site, as well as conduits running underneath the asphalt or the concrete. So one could theoretically send wire through those conduits in the future to support a charger in the future. EV ready spaces go a step further and actually have an outlet and wiring connecting the electrical service at the place of the parking spot, and then EV charging installed actually has an EV charger installed there. So in the building code, there's no requirement to do that, to go beyond EV capability thus far, but there are 2 pieces of legislation that we're monitoring that would make dramatic changes here. One is a piece of city legislation that would, if adopted, require greater levels of EV capability, as well as actually requiring EV chargers to be installed for the first time for smaller portions of the space. There's a state bill that's even more aggressive and would have statewide applicability, which we're also very curious to see what happens in the upcoming legislative session with that. And those 2 pieces of legislation would have the biggest impact. Given the fact that those are brewing and that this has generally been seen as a function of the building code when it comes to zoning, we're really focused on flexibility, giving people the opportunity to, if required to have EV charging in the future, have flexibility in terms of how they provide that EV charging, as well as how they share that EV charging investment with others. So excellent question. Hopefully that's insightful, help provide some insight into why we're approaching things the way we are. And thanks very much for that.
Thank you for that. So follow-up question from Suzanne, who I know sent a similar question ahead of time as well, asking about sort of as we think through legalization of cannabis in New York, what are we doing to help ensure that we don't add sort of zoning hurdles that you're describing that have been caught in the books, ensuring we're thinking it through as a part of these initiatives?
Matt, do you want to take that from like a ZO use streamlining perspective?
Sure. Well, what I'll say on cannabis is we're still working through the rulemaking process with our other city agency partners and with the state, which will be ultimately the regulatory arm for most cannabis businesses in the city and across New York State. But from a land use perspective, our overarching philosophy is to be as open to creating businesses as we possibly can be, and let the regulations sit with other parts of city and state government. So what I mean by this is if you're a business and your role is to sell in a retail type storefront cannabis, we think generally you should be allowed to sell cannabis like you are able to sell other types of retail products. So I think we're trying to take like a supply chain, if you will, approach to it, where you track each part of the cannabis production process and thinking about our existing topologies of businesses and land use that govern each part of that supply chain. But there will be more to come on this very shortly, and your comment is one that we're thinking about as well.
Thank you. I'm going to do some questions that we got ahead of time. It looks like we have time for at least one of them. So I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest challenge here to moving these amendments forward? Is it legal challenges? Is it popular support? What are you anticipating, and how are you hoping to help combat that?
Well, I'll start.
Yeah, go ahead, Nilus.
I'll start on the zero carbon side. So for the carbon neutrality project, we're hoping there won't be intense pushback. It's something that I think everyone understands in New York City, that we have a climate emergency that we need to respond to, and we urgently need to help people make the retrofits they need to make. Energy prices are rising. People are looking at, what can I do to mitigate those risks and cut my costs? And I think that that's a great opportunity for zoning to come in and support that by getting our, and oftentimes just underthought rules out of the way, so that that's not a problem for them. There's always concerns when we're doing a big zoning project. How will this impact the look and feel of my neighborhood? And that's definitely something we're mindful of. We want to roll these features out in a way that's sensitive to those concerns. So safeguarding that, providing parameters, sort of bumpers in the lane to ensure that these things can roll out carefully is definitely something that we're researching, and hopefully will ensure that it's smooth sailing. But that's the carbon neutrality front. Matt, it sounded like you were going to jump in on the economic opportunity.
Yeah, I know we have a minute left, so I'll just say quickly that in many respects, these changes that we're hoping to make are long overdue, and in many respects are what we think to be common sense. We've heard repeatedly from small business owners across the city that there's a million small ways in which zoning is making creating their business harder, and so we want to address those changes. And we're getting out in front as early as we can in the process to collect feedback and making sure we're responsive in making these changes.
Do I have a second?
Go for it, Zach.
All right, great. So, I think that we are mindful of the fact that some of the interventions that we're talking about doing under housing opportunity are potentially going to be hot button topics that a lot of people have feelings about. And that could end up being, there's going to be a lot of discussion about these things. So I don't think we're under any illusions that changes to parking requirements are going to be easy, no questions asked. We're just going to move through communities, especially lower density ones that truly are car dependent. So we do have to have a lot of conversations in those neighborhoods to make sure that what we're planning to do isn't too much or too little. We have a lot to balance there. And I would say that another thing that we're considering that for some of our major policy goals related to housing opportunities, some of the biggest hurdles are the fact that zoning isn't necessarily the thing that's standing in the way. And there are other agencies, state, things that we need to deal with, building code, multiple dwelling law that are actually outside of our hands, that we need to engage with other people and other legal bodies that may not have the same perspective, or just maybe tougher to work with, right? As someone who's doesn't really in charge of those things. I think we're well aware that there are challenges standing in the way of us and our housing goals to meet the housing need in New York City, but we're doing our best.
I know we're at time, so I think Laura is going to come back on to wrap us up. I do want to say, do you think these examples seem to have resonated with the group? We've got onslaught of questions kind of keep pouring in, so I think that's an incredibly good sign of what an interesting and informative presentation this has been. So thank each of you, and I'll pivot it to Laura.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, and thank you, Sam, Matt, and Nilus. I'll just reiterate that you all should visit the website that Matt mentioned earlier, so nyc.gov/cityofyes. We have a really unique opportunity here to weigh in on all of these proposals, and I thought this presentation was really great, and that there were a lot of tangible examples here that we all can relate to as we live, work, and play within New York City. So with that, I want to thank our presenters one more time, remind everyone to get out and vote during early voting or next Tuesday, November 8th. And thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Take care now. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.